but I want to welcome you on behalf of CPRE Norfolk to the annual general meeting, to the talk that we're going to have. I'm Tim O'Riordan. I'm the president of CPRE Norfolk, very honoured to be president, and thoroughly enjoy the task of being president, which I don't regard as very onerous, but very exciting and very worthwhile. But I have for all of you tonight an excellent speaker on a really important topic. Asher Minns is the Executive Director of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research. It's the core part of the climate change community, based in the University of East Anglia with outposts around the United Kingdom, and very closely connected to research centres all over the world. Asher's great quality is he's able to communicate a lot of different angles on science, social science, art, and people's feelings and people's concerns and people's hopes and people's fears in a variety of ways which are very meaningful to all of us. His great skill, in my view, is this wonderful way of communicating directly across all kinds of languages called science. And that also appeals to me as being an advocate, not just of interdisciplinary science, but as participatory science, science which brings people in. And I like particularly that Asher likes the concept of pollination. He pollinates research by flitting from one flower to another and allowing researchers themselves to realize they have much more common agendas than they realize without his intervention. So Asher, you have the greatest of an audience, and my great gratitude to you for spending some time this evening with us and sharing your ideas of life at the edge. So I'll leave it with you, my friend.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you, CPRE Norfolk, for the invitation, and thank you to 50 people who have joined, which is absolutely super. No need to do an introduction, apart from I'm now feeling a little bit like an insect, pollinating all those flowers.
Lots of sugar.
So I'll just start from the beginning, I think, is what we'll do. So please can everybody bring up another window on your browser and put in menti.com. We're going to see if we can do some little polls. Of course, this is completely to do with the gods of technology, not me, but we'll have a go. Okay, so I'll leave people to do that. So again, thank you very much for coming. One of the wonderful things of online, of course, is that lots of people can participate who otherwise might be busy or doing other things or far away. So what I'm going to try and do is talk to these topics. So life at the edge. Here we are living in East Anglia, all of us, and I'm going to talk to hopefully all of these topics about climate change, about COVID. The one I'm going to miss is farming. I'm not going to say much about that because it's a topic in its own right. So it's not that we can't discuss it in questions and things, but it's something that I think sort of needs looking at separately rather than me moulding it into everything. So here we are, COVID. Only 9% of adults want everything to go back to how it was before. And that was done quite early on. I think that was last April. And what were people saying? So we're thinking about, how could things be slightly differently around climate and environment? First, well, most people hope to change something about their life and to have learned about something. The majority, or significant majority of people taking a pause, thinking, well, this might offer us something different to what we have now. But then what were people noticing since it's in COVID? And like I said, this is quite early on. This was an April survey. Well, certainly they've been noticing they've been spending less money. But look at all these environmental topics that match to those what CPRE cares about. Cleaner air outdoors, air pollution, certainly for urban people, valuing food and other basic essentials. Do you remember all the shops went empty because people were buying basic ingredients rather than ready-made food? Stronger sense of community. Well, that's quite an interesting one. All to do with social mandate and how people live and work together. being in touch with other people who don't live with them, so community but extended, noticing wildlife more. They were feeling fitter. So many of these just map onto the idea of sort of building back better, and those CPRE priorities and the type of work that I'm interested in at the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research that Tim very nicely introduced. Then if we come to a later survey, this was done November, December last year. This is by one of our colleagues at the Tyndall Centre at Cardiff University, Wouter Portinger. And well, what are you worried about? And okay, these surveys are prompted, okay? So there's always a caveat with surveys that people might come up with other things, but these are prompted surveys. So quite clearly, you know, coronavirus was up there as a priority, or as up there as a worry. Destruction of nature, well, that seems to be quite a worry as well. Climate change, that's quite a broad worry as well. And then we can go on down the list, and interestingly, less people are worried about immigration than might think by following the media. Now, those different peoples, those different the different dots with the different colours are the different segmentation of the UK as how they think about climate change. So progressive activists, if you like, they're the people who are probably more the biggest advocate for climate change. They're probably making sort of behavioural changes or lobbying, or they're certainly the most attentive people to climate change. And then the pinks at the other end of the scale with the backbone conservatives, which doesn't mean political conservatives, I should point out. It means more conservative traditionalist people who are less interested. And so everybody, all those coloured dots were interested in coronavirus, but all those coloured dots with not very much spread were also interested in the destruction nature and climate change, a bit of a spread, but still not an enormous spread. Nearly everybody, you know, apart from the disengaged traditionalists, is worried about climate change at some level. And I could show you loads of other surveys that show the same thing, only not in the context of COVID. So really in-depth, very high quality social science surveys done across Europe show we're now at sort of 90% of people agree that climate change is happening across all European countries. About 80% say it's man-made, and similar sort of people are actually worried about it. And worry is the word that's used now. It's not, are you concerned about climate change? It's actually, are you worried about climate change? So far the majority of people are engaged with climate change, worried, concerned about climate change, and across the social spectrum there as well. Then comes the big question, well then who is responsible for action on COVID and climate change? And so for COVID, it was personal action. There's no need for me to rehearse everything that we've all been doing over the last year and a bit. So personal action, but less, personal action is less for climate change, whereas government, coronavirus and climate change are quite close together. So most people, while they think that personal action is certainly part of action on climate change, actually they see it more as an issue to do with government to take control of, or governments. And then that of course maybe comes to COP26, which is the big UN climate summit that's going to be in Glasgow in November, but maybe we can talk about that later. Now, in looking at this figure here, we then, really important to remember that for how people want to respond to both of these. So for coronavirus, absolutely they're happy to take personal responsibility, and they're happy to see the economy take a hit, basically. With climate change, they see some personal responsibility, but it's less to do with personal responsibility. However, in climate change, they're not willing to see the economy take a hit for climate change. It's very weak. I mean, I'm not going to show you the statistics for it, but it's very weak, the number of people who see economy and climate or in competition with each other. So if there's to be action on climate change, then it has to not disrupt the economy, unlike coronavirus, where people were or are supportive of disrupting the economy. So where are we now? So that's just sort of where people are thinking about climate change in the context of coronavirus, and then we come on to the Build Back Better topic. So it's all about global carbon emissions, climate change. So the big problem is too much fossil fuels being burnt, going into the atmosphere, and that really traps the sun's radiation and warms us up. That's what global warming is. This graph here, and so I've got a few graphs here, so I'll explain them all, and if the graphs aren't clear, then we can come back to them. So here you can see the amount of carbon going into the atmosphere in gigatons per year, and along the bottom is time. So here you can see a fairly clear rise. The black line goes up and up and up and up over time. You do see economic crises. Talk about economics. The amount of fossil fuel carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere is completely linked to GDP, to global productivity. So when there's economic crisis, carbon emissions reduce. However, what does happen is it bounces back almost immediately. You'll almost certainly have spotted when we get to 2020, there's this big dip. And I have no prizes for people who are thinking, yeah, clearly that's because of COVID. Huge economic lockdown all around the world. Productivity declines as measured by GDP. And of course, fossil fuels, the amount of fossil fuels being burnt decreases, less carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere. And then that little graph down the bottom there shows where the biggest reduction in carbon dioxide emissions was, which was April, which was the first lockdown, but it's still below zero. You can still see the emissions have gone down. And that pinky orangey line going down that's where emissions would probably need to be if we were getting towards net zero, which is this concept of truly zero emissions. So there's no more carbon dioxide going up into the atmosphere. So quite clearly different directions of travel, but COVID has given the biggest ever reduction in carbon dioxide emissions since the steam engine. So I've been sort of waving my hands about a bit, talking about the bigger picture stuff, the sort of the global picture. That I should have said, actually, that survey was a UK survey. Excuse me, all those were the UK surveys. And I spoke about that pinky orange line coming down of where we're supposed to be going on global carbon emissions versus where we're going, that black line going up, apart from when we keep hitting big economic downturns. This is what Norfolk should be doing to get to net zero emissions. I can do this for any local authority in the country. This is some work we have at the Tyndall Centre. It's about 13% per year reduction in carbon dioxide emissions is what that is to get to net zero, this idea of no more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at all. What goes up must come down, and that leads us into a conversation about agriculture, because some of the sucking out, the sequestration of the carbon out of the atmosphere will be done by plants and crops. But like I say, that's a wonderful topic, but a bit big for this one now. So the black line shows, so again, this is megatons, amounts of carbon dioxide on the axes, and then time along the bottom. So the black line shows progress so far, and that's pretty good. You know, this is even though I showed you the global carbon emissions going up, UK carbon emissions have been coming down. And as they have here, they've sort of leveled out a bit, and so you can see some recessions in there. You can sort of pick apart the numbers quite a lot. But what, the one that's that we really need to be looking at is that green ski slope. That would be certainly the Black Run. That would be quite a precipitous run to go down. But that's what the UK needs to do. That's what Norfolk needs to do. That's what every local authority needs to achieve if it's to get its emissions in line with the Paris target, the UN Paris Agreement of 2015, which is about net zero, which is about keeping carbon dioxide emissions below 2 degrees and ideally 1.5 degrees. I have to put a caveat to that statement, which was we're already at 1 degree already. So we only have half a degree to go in order to achieve the UN Paris Agreement. And that's what the conference in Glasgow in November is all about. It's the latest United Nations conference on progress and ambition on this Paris target. So that's quite steep, but that's the data. What would Norfolk look like in 2080? I've gone a little bit further out. It was a bit easier with the numbers. With kind of average global warming. So we're not talking about Paris Agreement. We're probably talking about 3.84 degrees of global warming here. So how does that translate to the impacts of Norfolk? I'll do the impacts first. So you know some of these quite well. Minus 30% of summer rainfall. So it's already the droughtiest region. It's going to get a droughtier region. Is that a real word? It's going to get more droughted than it is now. That obviously knocks onto agriculture. So we see at least 3% declines in wheat crops. 40 millimeters of sea level rise. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well. Much more flooding. Quite a lot of range around those numbers, +3 to 35% of winter flooding. So it doesn't rain in the summer anymore unless it's absolute deluge, and if it does rain, it's going to rain even more in the winter. However, there's some good story there. I'm not here as Mr. Doom, but maybe they're quite small, but the direction of travel is quite nice. So EVs, a little electric car there. Latest data is that there are now, in 2020, is 108,205. So that's not a huge amount, because I think there's nearly 40 million cars. I think there's more than one car per person if the population is 60 odd million. And that's about 6% of the market, but it is hugely increasing, and EVs will come down the line because of policy. Internal combustion engine cars will not be purchasable brand new. Seen a huge rise in solar. Any of us can see that actually going around the region, or if you catch the train down to London, remember we used to get on trains, then we can really see that solar PV all over, and that's going to grow more. And for any of us here right on the edge, it's not only a story of sea level rise, it's also a story of all those renewable turbines that we can see off the coast as well. Last year, 40% of electricity came from renewable sources, and that's quite remarkable in any way you measure it, almost 0 to 40%. And one of the really good news stories is in some of the work that we do around the global carbon budget. That black line going up is we can actually see renewables in there. We can see the amount of energy that's coming from renewables now. Probably 10 years ago, we couldn't see that. It wasn't visible in the global data, but it's now a little wedge, and it's growing. So there's the impacts, but there's also good news about mitigation. And I wanted to talk a little bit as well about about sea level rise, which I think we all know about here and possibly don't need to say too much, and coastal erosion, and of course Tim is an absolute expert on this, and it's something that's always happened on this coast. It will happen more, yeah, and it's increasing as we can see as we go out, as we see the news reports as well. And there are in particular, I don't know why that one's missing. In particular, you know, there's some breach points there that if the sea comes in there, it really affects the Broads. The Broads already has significant saline intrusions, for example, which affects the ecosystems, affects the fish. And this photo here, you all know it. Yeah, it's the gaps. I've spoken to people about the gaps, and it seems that quite a lot of people don't realise that the gaps are an enormous sea defence. You know, I think they're village names, Norfolk village names or something. When we're going through a gap, it's because there's this enormous concrete wall underneath the dune that's preventing these places from breaching, which is shown there. And you can even buy postcards celebrating Norfolk coastal erosion, so it's even become a sort of slight, you know, a tongue-in-cheek tourist attraction, perhaps. And that last picture is Coastal Partnership East, who are already doing some really good online consultations around the future of Hemsby. Yeah, brilliant, really picked up the online aspects of having to do consultations now. You can't get everybody in a village hall, so that's worth looking at as well. And there'll be more of those for those people interested in the coast or live on the coast. Back to my big black line of emissions going up, I want to point out that it's the top 10% of society, if you like, the economy, the population, who are responsible for nearly half of all emissions. And this is the most recent deprivation score from Norwich as our city, and the difference between the 2016 and the 2019 deprivation score is more wards have gone into social deprivation. Some of the people in Norwich are in the most deprived wards in the UK, and I think sometimes that's forgotten a bit, because around Norwich are some of the most wealthiest people in wards around the UK. So there's a big issue of equity here, of social justice and social fairness. We're not all in it together, and the deeper the red, the more deprived people are, as well as this is the county with the second lowest social mobility, which brings us to green jobs. This is some economic data from colleagues in Leeds. We currently spend, this is New Anglia, so Norfolk and Suffolk, about 7% of our entire income on our energy bills. If that was effectively invested into renewables and ways of saving energy rather than just paying the energy companies, it would be, that would save 724 million would be invested and cut. That actually equals out, as if you take an economic view of it, of 9,000 years of employment. This is by 2035, and it would actually cut emissions by a quarter from what the trajectory we're already on. So there's really big, clearly big arguments for really embracing the green jobs agenda as well. It's now sort of fairly basic economics. Actually, it's not as complex or controversial as it was, and you can see this in the financial newspapers. You can see this in so many companies talking about what it is they're doing and not insuring fossil fuel industries and other activities. And then there's also, this does talk a little bit about agriculture, but I wanted to point out the obvious one in a way that Norfolk isn't necessarily the biggest emitter either. This also shows the areas of coastal erosion. So again, it's the red is the highest emitters, and blue, purple is the lowest emitters. Of course, it's where the people are the highest emitters, and those little dots there, or the little upside down teardrops, are the hospitals, the UEA, the Briar chemical plant in North Norwich there. That's Cantley in the middle on the River Yare, the sugar beet plant, and then that's the waste recycling burning facility in Great Yarmouth, down the end of the seafront there. So those are the point sources. So if we were to, back to that top 10%, if we were to look at the places that really needed to make the biggest cuts in emissions, those are them. And then of course the red is just the general populations as well. And I'm going to come up, I think, with some recommendations here, because I'm talking with the good people of the CPRE. So I was very disappointed. You'd have to take out a year, don't you, with COVID, to find out a little bit more of a year ago. Very disappointed to find out that brand new houses are still being built in Norfolk, in the Broads National Park, that are oil powered. And some of these, and this isn't the houses, some of these even were social housing. So people in social housing, in the middle of their garden, they have an oil tank, a fossil fuel source. And so that's not only about carbon dioxide emissions, that's about fairness, that's about fuel poverty, lots of other things. So I'm thinking CPRE, this is more to do with planning. So Norfolk planners need to not give permission for houses that have got oil tanks, brand new houses. There is, of course, the Wensum Link viaduct. It's planned to go across the Wensum Valley. Lots of environmental destruction, changes to the landscape. It's a chalk stream. That needs re-evaluating. That needs re-evaluating in light of COVID as well. Changing habits. Is there really actually a business case for it now? The organisation campaigning against it are crowdsourcing for the judicial review that almost certainly will have to happen when Norfolk County Council says it should go ahead, and there'll be a judicial review of that. So I just mentioned that. Right now in Norwich, there is just started, there's a consultation going on around active travel. So that's something that people can get involved in or respond to, of what they would like to see. And and that's great to see the consultation on that, and they hope to attract funds for that. This graph here shows those personal choices. And I've put this in also because I was there talking about big stuff, dual carriageways that sort of feel probably a bit out of control. This shows the impacts that an individual can have in their life. So the biggest impact, not surprisingly, is less people having one fewer child. Second biggest impact is living car free. Third is not flying transatlantic, which doesn't apply to most people anyway. Then it's green energy. And so this is kind of, a really nice breakdown of the activities that people can do if, in their own household, in their own spheres of influence, they want to be minimizing their impact, at least as measured through carbon dioxide emissions as well. And my call to everybody, because I know that everybody's not going to get involved in the planning process or protesting around link roads, is what I want everybody to be is a climate change hero. There is something that those of us working in this field call the climate silence. Everybody's worried about climate change. You come back to those graphs I showed at the first about people who are actually worried about climate change. So many polls and surveys and really in-depth social science as well, focus groups, interviews, show people are worried, but people aren't talking about it enough. It's sort of been being hidden a bit. But COVID shows what a big social response can happen in the light of a substantial and existential and real world risk. So there's something more here, that we've seen a shift that there's never been seen before. And all of the stories about climate change, about all of the stories, there's 7 types of stories in the world. and all of them as triumph over adversity. They're all about redemption. Only one type of story is about tragedy. So I would really like everybody, now that we can get back to normal and we can actually talk to people, is just to start talking about climate and the environment much more than they are already. It's the thing that we know that people don't talk about as much as they want to talk about, and we've got no chance of healing anything unless people are really discussing it. So that's my call to you. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that's given plenty for questions.
Thank you, Asha. Thank you so much. Can you move back to the full screen?
Sure.
So we can see more of each other. But thank you very much for a very, very thought-provoking presentation with lots of up-to-date material, which I love very much. Now I'm looking for things in the chat box, and I don't see much in the chat box, but maybe anyone with a hand and a microphone on can ask a question. I'll be looking for a hand, or Asha can help to look for a hand. Who would like to raise a question from Asha's presentation?
We can go broader than things I put in the presentation as well. This is a big topic.
I'm going to start, Asha, on purely the follow through of this last slide of yours.
Mm-hmm.
What is Tindall doing, or what can be done in Norfolk in the preparation for COP26? I mean, is it ever going to be, you rightly pointed out that there are houses being built every single second of every day, which are still carbon emitting. There are houses being built which are water wasting. There are houses being built that are not using their waste materials well and are over consuming. We all know these things, but the planning system is gearing itself to flooding by actually not perforating the systems which are being put in place for development. Is there anything we can do a bit more with a Tindall lead as to how Norfolk can start a conversation as a county to get to net zero? Because by the time we get to November, we ought to be on that wonderful green curve of yours. And I noticed that the curve dips quite sharply after 2020. It's done, there's a real kick to it.
Yeah, absolutely is. Yeah, it's
what you call a vertical cliff, a bit like Chroma.
Yeah,
I'd love you to make any kind of comments as what you.
Yeah, sure. Well, that's a bit why I'm life at the edge, because it isn't necessarily edge. Yeah, it's edge in lots of ways, but I think it's also a little bit at the cutting edge as well. So as I understand, or as I experience it, I think Norfolk is the county in the UK that's most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. It's almost like a microcosm of the world. So in the UK, it's the most vulnerable for all the reasons you said: water, drought, sea level rise. It's not a particularly rich area. There's huge pockets of poverty. It is a bit like looking over across the planet here in one county. And there are activities planned and hopefully happening that will, what I would quite like to see, and I'm not sure if this is really going to exactly happen, but I would I'd like to see sort of Norwich, if you like, and I know not everybody's from Norwich here, but Norwich to be almost a satellite city to Glasgow, to really have a lot of activity here that reflects what's going on for the reasons that I've said. I don't know if I should say this in public, but I'm quite, there is quite a lot going on in Norfolk. Of the right people are having the right conversations and they're coming together, and the Chamber of Commerce is doing some activity. The Local Enterprise Partnership is doing activity. There's other people involved. So I'm actually quite hopeful that Norfolk has its own climate change committee, so independent scrutiny body that brings together all these independent parties to really put a sense of vision, a sense of purpose, a trajectory for where we want to get to, that's bottom up and top down. This isn't telling people what to do. It involves everybody who's interested. So that's something I would like to see happening specifically for Norfolk. Tim, you're exactly right. I think, is it 50,000 houses to be built in Norwich? But those 50,000 houses don't have to be the same houses. They can be better houses. in all sorts of ways. And
I'm going to interrupt you, Asher, because I think what you're saying about a Norfolk initiative, I'd like to come to right at the end. So we have a few questions. There's a question here: what could be the future economic impact if we don't take action on the climate reduction? In other words, what's the outcome of the picture you showed of 2080, that kind of thing?
Yeah, let's think. I probably couldn't put a number on that because we probably put more cost up the cost of mitigation than or the advantages of the cost of mitigation of reducing carbon emissions rather than the cost of the impacts. I don't think I've seen that for Norfolk, but there is things like the Stern Review and the updated Stern Review that talks about the economic impacts of climate change overall, and not surprisingly, you know, they go into the trillions. But the thing about all that work, it was done pre-COVID. So anything like that is kind of out of date now because we've had this sort of different type of economic societal shock. So I think all these things have to be updated in some way. And I think the economic impacts come in lots of different ways to lots of different sectors. But the Stern Review and other similar works always show that the economic benefits of working against climate change outweigh the benefits of paying for the impacts of climate change wherever you are in the world.
And can I ask a question?
Yes, please do. While I'm looking at a question, ask a question. Is that George? Who's asking? Who's speaking?
One of your...
Oh, nice to see you.
Hi, Tim. Hello, everybody. Asher, could we just explore a little bit and perhaps explain a little bit the shape of the green curve, which showed water coming down, but then it was, I think it was possibly a concave shape. However, I think, isn't there an argument to say that technology, like with solar panels, comes down in price? There's a sort of economic benefit that comes in and things accelerate given time in terms of carbon reduction. So in a way, I would wonder whether or not that curve would be better described if it was concave or whichever, convex, so that it's going to be difficult to start with. But look, like solar panels and wind generation, the price per unit has come down massively in the last decade, and therefore there's a rapid increase in uptake. And you know, there's a real positive story that technologies haven't kicked in fully yet, but as they kick in, it'll potentially get easier and easier for us on the big things to meet those reductions, which I think is a more positive story than Christ, it's all got to happen in 2021 and 2022, because look how much we've got to reduce.
I think, I guess it depends. So there is the technology will save us aspect is a large part of it, absolutely. In the times that the time horizons we're talking about existing technologies. So you're exactly right that it's sort of solar and wind, energy efficient technologies, possibly things like EVs in some economies. Net zero itself is only really this net zero idea is only really achieved by sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, either by new technology or by or including a biomass energy carbon capture and storage, which is using crops to burn for renewable energy. So none of those actually really work yet or have been tried out at any decent real scale at all. So we are very much relying on existing technologies, and those existing technologies make huge reductions in emissions, but they don't get us to net zero. So I think there's slightly different conversations around whether it's the net zero curve we're talking about or a technology adoption curve we're talking about. That one is net zero.
Well, Asher, there's another question which fits exactly to where you've just stopped. What's your view on hydrogen? Is hydrogen a viable option in your terms between now and 2050?
Not as only possibly as a transport fuel, but that's it. So not as a main fossil fuel swap out. No.
Geraldine, I don't know whether you're on the screen, but you've just said I'd like to ask a question. Are you unmuted, and could you ask your question, Geraldine?
Yes. So basically, you talk about electric cars. I don't know, or my personal opinion is I do not think that's the way forward. Electric cars have got lithium battery. Obviously, the minerals are being extracted from the earth, like cobalt and obvious lithium, and nickel as well. And wouldn't this just be another problem like the diesel problem of the future? I feel very adamant that we're just destroying the planet by using these different methods, and actually that none of the methods at the moment that have been suggested are suitable.
I think, I mean, EV is sort of in there in policy, if you like. So that's coming down the line, whatever. I think, trying to not go off topic. I mean, what we effectively what we need is very small scale, but yeah, active travel. But that doesn't work, and it certainly doesn't work in Norfolk. So what we really need is no cars. No fossil. No. We need to stop burning fossil fuels, and more than stop burning fossil fuels, we actually need to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. Norfolk itself, of course, it's a big county with relatively few sort of major conurbations. So Norfolk, 39% of Norfolk's emissions come from transport. Most counties, more urban counties, southeast counties, I don't know how to describe them, that's 25%. So most counties, about a quarter is from transport. Here it's 39%. So in some ways that also reflected back slightly on Tim's question about hydrogen. It's almost like, well, you're always a half glass full person in my job, but you really hope that hydrogen does help with transport. But that hydrogen obviously has to be made with renewable energy, not traditional energy. So I'm maybe not quite answering your question, but EV is going to be the transport technology. So I think we need to look at that. But what we really need to do is think about transport in a completely different way to how we traditionally looked at it in the 20th century. This is the 21st century. Let's think about it differently.
Anyone else got a question who would like, while we have a bit of a gap? Morris?
Morris as well.
Yes,
I see.
I'm Dinah. I'm the other half. I'm Dinah. Hello. I live in Reetham, which, as you'll know, is not that far from Norwich, but it's still pretty countrified. We're in great danger, just talking about planning briefly, of having hundreds of houses dumped on a green field very close by, which we're trying to fight with the help of the CPRE, for which I thank you all. My question is really to do with one of the early graphs where you showed the relative sense of responsibility the individuals have for coronavirus as compared with climate change. And there was a discrepancy where people feel more responsible personally for managing coronavirus than they do for climate change, which is good on one hand, but on the other hand, somewhat disappointing. Now, I imagine, I'm guessing that you can confirm this if you would, that actually what government does actually does make a difference to how people behave in relation to things like climate change, whether they take responsibility. And sadly, we've seen over several decades now that governments have not given the support to individuals like ourselves for things like returning funds for solar panel investment, for example, and other sorts of investment. I mean, EV cars are a good example now because they're so expensive. But actually, if they were subsidised, or if there was some way in which you could be given loans, which you could pay back over a long period of time, there might be more uptake, that sort of thing. And obviously in Norfolk, because we're very widespread, we do need to use cars, and particularly after coronavirus. So could you possibly give any indication of what you think governments could do possibly, to encourage people like ourselves, how that could change?
Yeah, I mean, I've worked alongside government for quite a long time, so I'm gonna hop that one. But what I will say is I actually look at it slightly different, or back to front maybe, which is I think government needs the social mandate to act, to act more, and I think. And if we go back to that graph that you kindly sort of pointed out from the beginning there, it had a social mandate to act on COVID. People literally locked up their houses, pretty much. And that meant that they could do what it is that they thought needed doing, you know, for right or wrong. That's a different discussion entirely. And that was almost my last point. I was a bit running out of time, so I didn't want to labour it. But for a social mandate on climate, we have to be more activist, and I don't necessarily mean protesting. I mean that talking about climate, making it known that there is strong public support for action on climate. I would love this year, and I don't want the government to run it, given that it is this UN climate summit in Glasgow, which is really important, to have a public engagement campaign, a UK public engagement campaign, or a Norfolk campaign, or a Shropshire campaign from Sarah there, that just like we had on COVID, but about climate and environment. So I think so many politicians I've spoken to over the years, it's changing a little bit now maybe, but they think that they're so behind the curve on what it is that the public are interested in on climate and environment. They think it's a minority thing, and it's just like a, you know, for that one Green MP down in Brighton or whatever, and it really isn't. And every survey, every poll, every focus group, it's not just because I hang out with people who are environment types, these are Mori surveys and things. So it's a lot of it is to do with that social mandate, to show government that they have the support to act, rather than just it's one small group of particular people in a particular party who are sort of seem to be controlling that thought. So a lot of it is that coming together, I think, of that sort of top-down government to do incentives around EVs or whatever it is, but actually a lot of it is this social momentum from below. And I don't really mean that as a sort of, as a rather sort of hair-shirted community thing. It's just that, like COVID, there was a social mandate and people did it.
Just to sum up a bit and see what we can do from a session like this CPRE Norfolk in relation to Asher's challenge for a champion, a CPRE type of champion. And first of all, to remind you all that there are these CPRE Awards, which are going to be put forward and voted on toward the middle of the year, June or July. And if any of you know people who would like or would be eligible for one or other of the awards, just to remind you what the awards are. One is for a countryside champion, anyone who's doing something to improve the countryside, someone who is improving rural living in any way you can define that. They're very community orientated or personal orientated. Something around the idea of digging deeper, actually making more from the whole process of living in a more efficient way. And last one, I'm just going to bring it up from my screen here, is good lighting design. So we have these four things: rural living, countryside champions, digging deep, i.e. putting something back into the countryside and into community, and good lighting design, all of which are very relevant to a post-COVID age. So my first question, my plea to you is, if you know of anyone or a group or whatever who could do something about this, please let Sue here know, because she's coordinating all the inputs, and we would love to try and get some awards appointed this year because it's such a good point. The other thing is about this notion of some kind of preparation in Norwich and Norfolk for COP and beyond, because COP is just a staging post, as Asher made out. It's a step in a long journey called the Paris Agreement. And I would just leave you with a thought that we might be looking at some need to have a community dialogue, some kind of community climate forum, post-COVID, post-carbon, where we can look at the questions that are being raised about housing, about flooding, about economy, about jobs, about, above all, young people, and how they might be able to embrace this new age, and what we can do about adapting, as well as to trying to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases, but above all, enhance the natural world and enhance our communities living in the natural world. So I personally would love to see Norfolk have something like a climate change commission, of the equivalent to the Committee on Climate Change, but led or at least encouraged by young people with a very broad cross-section across the county. I'm not going to say any more than that. That's a kind of rather exciting comment that Asher has brought to the table. It's very relevant. Whether we can mobilize our NGOs, non-governmental bodies and others toward this task, I don't know. But it does concern me as a purely because I've been involved with this so long, but so many decisions are not being altered. We're carrying on driving, we're carrying on wasting energy, we're carrying on planning in such a way as to be despoiling the countryside and creating all the outcomes which are negative from the point of view of sustainability. And I just feel that we've really got to start taking a stand, and this is the opportunity for doing it. So I'm leaving you with the thought that Ash has given us a call to arms. And there is in there what we can do personally, but there's also a lot in there about what we can do collectively. And I'm leaving you to choose that line of approach. And maybe amongst us all, we'll look again at how we might address this as a joint citizen, personal, governmental responsibility. Potinga's diagram has everybody up there, government and people and responsibility in a little cluster. We need to make that something which is much more democratic in the literal sense of the word, creating opportunities for people to be directly involved in improving their lives and the livelihoods of those who are still to come. So it's on that framework. I want to thank Asher so much for a very stimulating talk, raising issues that I think are extremely relevant, making us clear that it's not going to come easy and we're going to have to work very hard to get any of these outcomes, but that the outcome is worth going for, especially for those who have, all of us, who have children and grandchildren, who must have a life that we believe is worth while and why they might respect us for what we give to them. And that includes the natural world, because for every human being, there are billions of creatures, not human, who are utterly vital for the well-being of the planet Earth and for those who come after us. So in the context of all that, I thank you all for listening, for being stimulated by what Asher has said, and maybe thinking about how we might move through the awards and through our own personal behaviour into a more collective dialogue to move this county forward.
I just, Alexandra just said, or Alex just said that she wanted to make a question. So, and in particular, I think represent a slightly different generation to you and me.
Absolutely.
And so quite nice to hear something else. So sorry to interrupt, but I didn't want anybody to feel that they'd missed out.
No,
thanks. Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much, because this has been amazing, and I am particularly interested, and I've always been interested in climate change and its impact. Something that I'd quite like to see from the government is actually an implementation of a carbon tax. I don't know if you had any thoughts around that, and if people have similar interests in this to me, but I think it would be a real motivation to those who maybe aren't as engaged to see the impacts of what they're doing, and then the monetary value associated with that.
Does anyone else of the younger generations, one or two on the screen and probably some off the screen? Jenny, would you like to say anything? I'd love to hear from you.
Hello, I'm currently a member of my parish council, and we have quite a few planning applications for new eco houses, and they are eco houses. They are very I wouldn't say low carbon, but they don't use up much energy to run. And I just don't know what to think about, demolishing a original build and replacing it with an eco house, if that's actually helpful, or if it's just an excuse to justify building a big house that's new. I just can't get my head around it.
That calculation can be done, actually, because there's so much embedded carbon within an existing house building or whatever because of the concrete, the cement, the bricks, the amount of energy that went into it. So there's actually an organisation out there called CIBSE, C-I-B-S-E. I'm not going to try and remember the acronym, but there is calculations to do exactly that. Is it better to have new or better to have old? We did some analysis, early 2000s. Yes, I am that old. So probably about 2004, something like that. That I'm afraid our headline was actually that about 40% of Victorian houses need to be demolished in the UK because of that equation. That's actually called the 40% house. So it's very out of date, but if you wanted to look that up online, you could find the 40% house. But that's been done much better since, and that was an early work. There are now standard methodologies for doing this trade-off that you're interested in.
So I'm very sorry about this, but I think we're going to have to draw this to a close. Does anyone want any last desperate remark to make, or can we thank Asher again, reflect on things? There's a huge issue, and we can't cover it all. Derek, you have a problem with voice, but do your best.
Okay, where is tidal, the potential of tidal energy in all of this? We've got a huge amount of coast and very large changes in tides around the UK.
Yeah, huge potential. Everybody else is doing it. I'm not quite sure why they don't do it in the UK as much as they should by just adopting the technologies that exist elsewhere.
Thank you.
I think, I'm sorry to say to you all, I want to wish you well. I have, I'm afraid, another meeting, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave right away. But I want to thank again my wonderful friend Asher for the great presentation, really stimulating. And let's not leave it at just the end of this meeting. Let's see if we can talk something out to take us toward 2030 with some excitement and some purpose. But in the context of all of this, thank you for coming. Thank you for enjoying the CPRE Norfolk AGM. And above all, best wishes to you and all that you do to make your lives and everyone else's lives better. Take care and good luck.
Thanks. It was a really nice evening. Thank you. Best wishes to all of you. Bye now. Bye.